Hello everybody, we're going to be continuing the Infinite Jest video series. Today we're picking up on page 87, April 30th, year of the dependent adult undergarment. This is 28 days later of the same year where we just left off when the medical attaché received in the mail that entertainment. So April 30th, where we're at here is we have a new character named Maroth, and he's in Tucson, Arizona. He's currently killing time, and he's in a wheelchair at the top of a mountain, and the sun is in such a location that he's able to cast a shadow of himself over the city of Tucson. And so he's essentially just playing with his shadow that he refers to as a specter or a wraith. And he's killing time with his shadow, and out of the blue comes Hugh Steepley, who is a member of the United States Bureau of Unspecified Services. It's kind of like the modern FBI in a way. And Hugh Steepley is dressed up on his field assignment is to dress up like a woman to hide his identity, and he's not doing a very good job of it because he's a kind of overweight man, and he has all the mannerisms of a man, and despite that he still is trying to do his best to wear high heels and stuff like that, but Maroth just finds it pretty ridiculous. So what we learn is that Maroth is meeting with Hugh Steepley in this desert because Maroth is in the Wheelchair Assassins group. It's a terrorist group that's considered anti-Onan, so they're against the North American continent and the countries that make it up. And so he's in this wheelchair assassination terrorist group, and he is what is called a quadruple agent. So he's pretending to betray the organization. And so what that means is that he's essentially in the wheelchair assassination group, but he's feeding information about the group to Hugh Steepley. And Maroth is doing this because he has a very sick wife, and because he can feed information to the Bureau of Unspecified Services, his wife can get some medical treatment. And Hugh Steepley is talking to Maroth and asking about the entertainment. That's what they call it in quotes. And that's what we were reading about on April 2nd. And this is what the medical attaché received in the mail, that fatally attractive entertainment. And what was interesting was Hugh Steepley believed that the wheelchair assassins were behind sending this particular entertainment, but Hugh Steepley, Maroth doesn't really own it. He doesn't say that the wheelchair assassination group sent it. And it was also a little odd to Hugh Steepley because the target of the entertainment wasn't a figure of political value. It was somebody who was fairly important. It was the medical attaché of, the kind of king of electronic and entertainment, but it wasn't a political target. So that was a little odd. But this particular medical attaché, we come to learn, did have some connection with the widow of the author of the entertainment. And we learn that the medical attaché during his residency had some sexual relations with the widow of the author of the entertainment. We also learned that the widow was from Quebec and was from an area called the Islet County and was on a terrorist watch list for 3 years. So while this could just be about anybody, we do know from an earlier chapter, not too long ago, I think maybe a video or two ago, that Avril and Cadenza, so this would be Hal's mom, and wife of James Incandenza. We know she was on a terrorist watch list. We know that her marriage to James Incandenza and her having Orrin, their first child, was of some political value. And so it seems to be that signs point to this widow of the entertainment being Avril Incandenza. That also means that the author of the entertainment was James Incandenza, which makes a little bit of sense as well, because we learned that whoever made the entertainment worked at the Atomic Energy Commission, and we know that James Incandenza worked there, and he was also a filmmaker. James Incandenza was. So obviously someone had to make this film, and there's really only been one filmmaker so far in this book. So that's a pretty big deal. I mean, we can't confirm it yet, but all those signs point to Avril actually being kind of a part of all of this in some way. We then learn about Rodney Tyne. His nickname is Rod the God, and he's chief of the Bureau of Unspecified Services. So this is Hugh Steepley's boss, essentially. And he's designated the architect of kind of the modern United States of America, the modern Onan. And we learned that there's some oddities with Rodney Tyne, because yes, he does work for the United States Bureau of Unspecified Services, but his stenographer was the same stenographer that M. Duplessis had. And M. Duplessis, if you remember, was the man who was killed accidentally by Don Gately when Don Gately was robbing his house. And so M. Duplessis was a member of a Pan-Canadian resistance terrorist group. And his stenographer was named Mademoiselle Luria Peck. And this Luria Peck is of Islet County. So essentially, it seems like perhaps Avril Incandenza could be having a fake name, Mademoiselle Luria Peck, and perhaps she not only was the widow of the author of the entertainment that's being discussed, but also kind of the sexual attractive partner to Rodney Tyne. And so there's the worry that this Mademoiselle Luria Peck has a Canadian focused agenda, and that would not be the agenda that Rodney Tyne should be following, but there's a worry that maybe Rodney Tyne is actually a double agent, and Rodney Tyne could be changed to follow a more Canadian perspective. And so we know that actually another reason why we can suspect Luria Peck as Avril Incandenza is because Luria Peck and M. Duplessis were mentioned in the scene with Hal when he was talking to the professional conversationalist, who we now know is his dad, James Incandenza, because James Incandenza says something along the lines of, "Do you really think I wouldn't dive beak deep into your family's, past relationship with Luria P. and M. Duplessis?" So even his own dad knew that his family had some connection with Luria P. and M. Duplessis. At the time, we had no idea what James Incandenza was talking about, but it seems like we do now. So now we have a little bit of a break, and we switch over to what's called the Great Concavity. And this is over the northeastern part of what we think of as the United States, and we're following the herd of feral hamsters. And two hamsters were left there during what was called the experialist migration. So this would be the inverse of imperialism, which would be taking over someone else's land. So experialist migration would actually be giving away our land. and who he gave it to was Canada, actually. So Vermont, or what used to be Vermont, is now a completely denuded location, so there's nothing growing in it. However, Maine is a lush forest, and that's because it has kind of a annular over-fertilization. And so we don't know much about this land except that it's now the property of Canada, and for whatever reason there's a poisonous gas hanging over this land, and it's described as being a poisonous gas that's actually able to cause birth defects. And so it's nothing you want to mess with, but it doesn't really bother current America because we have these giant fans that blow the poisonous gas northward into Canada. So we basically don't know how, but the land is poisoned, we gave it away, and now we're blowing the poisonous gas away from us and into, you know, the face of a neighbor or an ally. So that's all we know about the concavity right now. And it's also important to think concavity, something that's concave is like a hole, right? And so perhaps that can give us some idea to how this land got to the state it currently is. We don't know yet why it's called that, though. We're now shifting scenes a little bit. So we're going to be shifting from this scene, which is in the locker room at the ETA, the Enfield Tennis Academy, and we'll go back to Maroth and Steepley. So this is Year of the Dependent Adult Undergarment, November 3rd, so that's later in the year. So we essentially have all the main students sitting in the locker room, and they're just exhausted, and they're not being complaining teenagers. They really do have a crazy schedule. You know, they wake up, they practice all day long, then they have homework until, you know, the wee hours of the night. And so they talk about how they're so tired it's indescribable. You know, they have to come up with, you know, more and more hyperbolic terms to describe how tired they are. We do know that we get an insight to how bright Hal is at this point, because they have a test tomorrow and nobody wants to study, and it doesn't seem like Hal really has studied much, but it's clear that everyone wants to cheat from Hal tomorrow because Hal's the smartest kid. And this is interesting because we knew from the very beginning chapter that he really couldn't even talk, and yet here he is talking amongst his classmates, and because of what he's saying, he's now somebody they all want to sit next to during the test. So at one point, Hal was definitely a very bright man. We don't know what happened to him, but you know, at one point in time, he was very bright. It's also interesting because we learn a little bit about what Hal looks like, and Hal is said to look to be the only son of James and Cadenza and Avril that looks like his dad. So Hal and James and Cadenza both look very Indian-like, they describe. So they have some Indian blood in them, and so they have very black hair. They have naturally brown skin. They say his untanned feet look like kind of brewed tea. And Oren looks a lot like his mom. They say he's got this immaculate posture. He's very flexible. And Mario, who is Hal's roommate, which we've talked about, looks like no one they know, which is very interesting because the other two brothers, it's so evident to them who won the genetic battle, whether it was the mom or the dad. And then in Mario, it's not clear. So that's kind of interesting. And the kids, as they're talking about how tired they are in the locker room, they are kind of playing the blame game. They're trying to focus their dissatisfaction and their upset nature to somebody. And so they will blame Charles Tavis, the head of Einfield Tennis Academy. They'll also blame Gerard Stitt, who is essentially their head coach. And so they're just kind of fuming. You know, they're kind of pissed off that they're so tired, and they just want somebody to blame. Now we go back to both Maroth and Steepley. They're still in the desert. No time's changed. It's April 30th. And so they're talking about Rodney Tyne and Rod the God and Luria. And they talk about how, Hugh Steepley talks about how their relationship, Rodney Tyne and Luria Perec, who, keep in mind, is probably Avril and Cadenza, how they have a love that is worth singing about. And then they go on to a philosophical conversation about how you choose your love. So Steepley, who is an American, believes that you can choose what you love. Meaning perhaps you could look at everything out there in the universe and say, I want to love this woman, or I want to love this sport. And Maroth thinks that's just very American and very naive. And you know, he makes the point that he says, you know, sometimes you can't choose what to love. Sometimes you just see her and you just fall in love immediately, and you didn't think about it. You didn't write a pros and cons list. You just find that temple in your life that you worship. And he talks about how the idea that you can choose the temple you worship at is actually a horrible thing, because when you think you can choose the temple you worship at, what you're really doing is worshiping yourself. You make yourself the temple. And when you make yourself the temple, you really are based on nothing. They describe it as you're the worst kind of slave, in that you don't know that you're in bondage. And it's just a really, really good philosophical statement. And keep in mind what it connects to. It connects to the entertainment. The medical attaché, while yes, he did put in the entertainment, however, he didn't really choose to watch it until he soiled himself. It just came to him, and he couldn't help but love it. And Maroth kind of makes the point of, you know, Steepley, if Americans could choose what they love, why would you be worried about this entertainment getting out there? Because they could just choose not to love it. And I think that will be an interesting point we follow up in the upcoming chapters. So where we're at now is we just finished. This is actually a little bit longer than the last couple of chapters. We're now on page 109. So we will continue on in the next video. Thank you.